Yeah, so it's great to be here to taste the 19, and I'm curious to see how it is because the year 18 was insanely good. I gave it 100 points. So what do you think about 19 compared to 18?
Well, in terms of the vintage characteristics, it was really a completely different vintage. We spoke about the 18 as being a year with less than average rainfall. So typically here in Yountville, we get about 31 inches per year. And in 2018, we had 22 inches, so about 2/3. In 2019, we had 54 inches, so a lot more than average. So it was a really rainy year. But more important than that is that the rain fell between January and March. So those were really rainy months with much higher than average rainfall. And that we consider late rainfall. So with 38 inches falling in January, February, and March, we had a dry April. So the soil started to dry out, which gave us some hope for a balanced foliage. And then we had the month of April with nearly 4 inches of rain. Again, so that, and in April, typically we'll have less than an inch. So that was 4 times more than average at least. And so it set up the spring for just really wet soils and a lot of vegetative growth, which meant a lot more work in the vineyard. In a year like that, in a rainy year where we have a lot of growth, the primary focus is opening up the canopy to let the sun shine in. And what's interesting is we did an experiment in 2019 where we said there are 2 options. We can let the vines grow, let's say naturally, in their vigorous and vibrant way, or we can start removing foliage early. And we'll see the effect at the end of the season. So the end of the season, oftentimes at the end of August and beginning of September, we can have heat spikes with really dry weather. So would a vine with more foliage resist more, or with less foliage that we had cleared out early?
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a fascinating experiment because finally what we learned is that by removing foliage early and letting the sun shine in the canopy, the grapes get accustomed to sunlight. And so during a couple of heat spikes, so we had 105 degrees, and it's always accompanied with very low humidity in August, and then 102 degrees at the beginning of September, the vines that had their canopy opened up resisted perfectly, and there was no damage. But the vines that had a lot more foliage, the grapes hadn't been exposed to that heat and sun. And so when they did get exposed to that sunlight on those hot days, they were blanched. And so you had some berries that looked like they had been soaked in hot water.
So can it didn't affect the thickness of the skins?
The heat spike?
No, the foliage differences.
So, yeah, I mean, of course, when you open up the canopy and you expose grapes early on, the skins develop a thick sort of coating to protect themselves. And so those berries were beautiful and nice, but the berries that on those experimental blocks that were thinned later didn't do as well.
Did you need to be more careful with extractions on the ones exposed to the sun?
So what's clear, what that required was an incredible selection. So you had to remove all of those berries. Those you couldn't have made wine with, those berries that had been blanched. So anything that was exposed to the sun that had damage had to be removed. And that's where our sorting line at reception was really valuable.
So we know that 19 was a bigger crop, and was that due to the early rains? Definitely.
So when you have a lot of water in the soils, the grape clusters are naturally bigger. And even though we had a very cold month of May, in fact, we had some record temperatures, low temperatures in the month of May, which is during bloom, which is normally when you establish the number of berries per cluster. It didn't seem to affect the number of berries per cluster. So we still had a good number of berries. The clusters were really pretty big. and the ratio of skin to juice was lower than a typical year. So you had big berries. And in a year like that, it's not typically recognized as a great quality to have low skin to juice ratios. So you have two possibilities. You can take what you have and try to mask that, and you can try to over ripen. You can try to over extract or over oak to mask it, or you can kind of be honest with what you've got and still target a balanced harvest date. Extract carefully, because you don't want to extract any. If you try to get more than what you got, it inevitably feels imbalanced.
Did you have to bleed the vats?
So we did bleed some if we had big berries on some lots, but it wasn't necessary everywhere. Yeah.
So are you saying that 18 was actually a little bit easier then?
Well, I would say much easier. Yeah,
that's really interesting.
It was almost it required very little effort, whereas 2019 required a lot of effort, and that's just the what happens in our industry. Is in winemaking, you have these years that flow, and other years where you're trying to catch up.
But at least you had the harvest dates. You could really pick the harvest. There wasn't a lot of pressure, right?
That's true. It was a late year.
Yeah.
The entire year started late. Every stage from bud break, bloom, veraison, and harvest was late. So we're on a late schedule, but nevertheless, because the harvest date really determines the complexity of your wine, because you have as a fruit ripens, your complexity grows, and you reach a peak, and that peak can last. And in this particular year, the window is really narrow, maybe a half a day or a day, and then your complexity starts to decrease. So if you don't find that window and harvest then, you've lost a bit of complexity. And so you have to be super attentive, especially, I would say, on a year like this. Because in a year like this, the peak is sharper. Whereas some years go like that. And that there's a plateau, where the plateau in 2019 was very narrow.
But how do you see that? That's through tasting.
Oh, you have to taste. You taste every single day. And in some blocks, you have to taste twice a day, because is it ready today? We'll see this afternoon. You taste again. Or is it going to be ready tomorrow? And you're just constantly tasting and staying. It's kind of like riding a wave if you're surfing. Yeah. You have to stay right on the edge, and it's all about timing.
Yeah, but also you have to have a good talent to be able to taste and actually know what you're tasting, right?
Well, I would argue that you have to listen, and you have to be observant, and you have to be present. You have to be attentive. So it's, I think, more about a practice than having some marvelous talent.
But you know that also a lot of people pick by numbers. Oh, the pH is going down. Oh, the Brix is that level.
Yeah, I mean, within wine, there are industrially made wines, and there are wines that are handmade in a craftsman style, I would say. Yeah. And what's nice about that idea is that knowledge and that way of working is passed on from generation to generation. So there's a sense of maintaining tradition and maybe offering your little tweak of what you've learned or what technology has offered you. So there's a constantly perfection. You're constantly perfecting the process, and that's nice.